Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're about to witness a dramatic and emotional chapter in Tulak and CEO Kwan's story. Just when they finally found each other and confessed their true feelings, a shocking tragedy struck in the middle of a stormy night. Did CEO Kwan survive the terrifying fall into the dark ravine? Or has Tulak lost him forever? Stay with us to uncover what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our upcoming videos. The small piece of torn fabric fluttered in the cold night wind as CEO Kwan held it tightly in his hand. For a moment, nobody spoke. The beam from several flashlights illuminated the pale cloth hanging from the broken branch, and every villager standing nearby immediately recognized it. It belonged to Tulak. Only a few hours earlier, she had been wearing that same shirt when she left the village to help what she believed was an elderly woman in need. Now a torn piece of that shirt was the first real clue anyone had found. The forest suddenly felt colder. The silence became heavier. CEO Kwan stared at the fabric for several long seconds. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it inside his ears. Until now, he had been desperately hoping there was some simple explanation. Maybe Tulak had gotten lost. Maybe her phone battery had died. Maybe she was stranded somewhere and unable to contact anyone. But this changed everything. The torn fabric confirmed what he had feared from the beginning. Something had happened. Something was very wrong. A village elder stepped closer. "Do you think she passed through here?" CEO Kwan slowly nodded. "She did." His voice sounded lower than usual, more serious, more dangerous. He carefully removed the fabric from the branch and folded it into his pocket. Then he turned toward the villagers. "We keep searching." Nobody hesitated. More than 30 villagers had joined the search effort by now. Some carried flashlights, others carried lanterns. Several younger men held wooden sticks in case they encountered wild animals in the forest. Everyone respected Tulak. Everyone knew how kind she was. The entire village wanted her home safely. The search continued. Groups split up and moved in different directions. Flashlights swept across bushes, trees, and muddy paths. The forest had become eerily quiet. Even the insects seemed quieter than normal. CEO Kwan walked faster than everyone else. His clothes were covered with dirt. His shoes were soaked. His arms were scratched from pushing through thick branches. But he barely noticed. Every thought in his mind centered on one person, Tulak. Images of her kept appearing inside his head. Her smile while working in the watermelon field. Her laughter when they made watermelon jelly together. The way she always cared about other people before herself. The way she could turn even an ordinary day into something meaningful. The more he thought about her, the harder it became to control the fear growing inside his chest. What if he was too late? What if she was hurt? What if she was frightened and alone right now? He clenched his jaw. No, he refused to think that way. He would find her, no matter what it took. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. Fast, uneven, desperate. Several villagers immediately turned their flashlights toward the sound. A figure emerged from between the trees, a young woman, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. "CEO Kwan!" The voice instantly caught everyone's attention. It was Trin. She nearly stumbled while running toward them. Her hair was messy. Her face was pale. She looked like someone who had been crying for a long time. CEO Kwan frowned. "Trin?" She stopped in front of him, struggling to catch her breath. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Finally, she forced the words out. "My father." The moment she said those words, something changed. CEO Kwan's expression hardened. "What about your father?" Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "I think he knows something." The villagers exchanged confused looks. Nobody understood. "What do you mean?" CEO Kwan asked. Trin lowered her head. Shame filled her face. I think he had something to do with Tieu Lac's disappearance. The forest instantly fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several villagers stared at her in complete disbelief. CEO Quan's eyes widened slightly. For a brief moment, he thought he had misunderstood. Then anger surged through him. "What did you say?" Trin immediately shook her head. "I didn't know." Her voice broke. "I swear I didn't know anything." CEO Quan took a step forward. His face was colder than she had ever seen. "Explain." Tears continued streaming down her face. So she told them everything. How she had admired CEO Quan for a long time. How her father had noticed her feelings. How he became increasingly obsessed with helping her. How he kept asking questions about Tieu Lac. How he watched her daily routine. How he seemed strangely calm when everyone else was panicking. And finally, the expression she had seen earlier that evening. The guilt, the fear, the regret. When Trin finished speaking, several villagers looked stunned. Others looked furious. Nobody wanted to believe that someone from their own village could be involved. CEO Quan stood motionless. His fists slowly tightened. He wasn't angry at Trin. She clearly hadn't known. But if her suspicions were true, then someone had deliberately targeted Tieu Lac. Someone had intentionally caused all of this. The thought made his blood boil. Trin wiped away tears. "I know this is my fault too." "No," CEO Quan interrupted. She looked up. He shook his head. "You didn't do this." More tears appeared in her eyes. "I should have stopped him." "You didn't know." Trin lowered her gaze again. The guilt remained. Before anyone could continue speaking, another voice suddenly emerged from behind them. A familiar voice, a tired voice, a voice filled with shame. "She's right." Everyone immediately turned. Standing several meters away was Trin's father. His shoulders were slumped. His clothes looked disheveled. The confidence he normally carried was completely gone. Instead, he looked like a man carrying a burden far too heavy to bear. Trin froze. "Dad!" Her voice trembled. He couldn't look at her. The disappointment in her eyes hurt more than anything else. CEO Quan slowly stepped forward. The older man finally raised his head. For the first time that night, their eyes met. The atmosphere became tense. Several villagers moved closer. Some looked ready to confront him immediately, but nobody spoke. Everyone waited. CEO Quan broke the silence. "Tell me where she is." The older man's throat tightened. For a few seconds, he couldn't answer. Then he finally spoke. Everything came pouring out. The jealousy, the poor decisions, the excuses he had made for himself, the lies he had told himself. He admitted hiring men from another village. He admitted arranging the fake request for help. He admitted helping create the situation that led to Tieu Lac's disappearance. Every word sounded worse than the last. Trin cried openly. Several villagers shook their heads in disgust. One elderly man couldn't hide his anger. "How could you do something like this?" The older man had no answer, because deep down, he knew there wasn't one. Nothing could justify what he had done. Not love, not concern for his daughter, nothing. When he finally finished speaking, nobody defended him, not even Trin. She looked heartbroken. CEO Quan's face remained expressionless, but inside, anger was raging. He imagined Tieu Lac trapped somewhere, terrified, wondering if anyone would find her, and all because of one selfish decision. The older man swallowed hard. "I never wanted anyone hurt." CEO Quan's response came immediately. "But she was hurt." The words struck harder than a slap. The older man's shoulders sagged even further. For the first time, the full weight of his actions seemed to crush him. "I know." CEO Quan stepped closer. "Where is she?" This time, the older man didn't hesitate. He pointed deeper into the forest. "There is an abandoned storage building near the northern ridge." Everyone listened carefully. "It was supposed to be temporary." His voice shook. "They said they would keep her there." A younger villager frowned. Supposed to? The older man nodded nervously. I don't know if she's still there. That answer immediately increased everyone's urgency. CEO Quân turned toward the search group. We move now? The villagers nodded. Nobody wasted time. Flashlights were raised, lanterns were checked. The entire group immediately changed direction. They began moving deeper into the forest. Above them, dark storm clouds covered the sky. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain was coming. Far away from the search party, Tu Lac sat alone inside an old storage building hidden among the trees. The room was dark. Dust covered the floor. Broken wooden crates lined the walls. A single weak light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering occasionally. The atmosphere felt cold and abandoned. Hours had passed. Maybe 4, maybe 6. She wasn't sure anymore. Time had become impossible to track. At first, she had tried remaining calm. She told herself someone would notice her disappearance. Someone would come looking. But as darkness settled over the forest, the fear became harder to ignore. Every strange sound made her jump. Every creak from the building made her heart race. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm, trying to stay strong, trying not to panic. Outside, voices occasionally drifted through the walls. The men guarding her were still nearby. Sometimes she heard them talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes arguing. Every sound reminded her of the situation she was trapped in. She wasn't tied up. She wasn't physically harmed, but the uncertainty was terrifying. She had no idea what they planned to do next. The old building suddenly creaked. A strong gust of wind rattled the roof. Tu Lac looked toward the small window near the ceiling. Dark clouds filled the sky. A storm was approaching. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. Drip, drip, drip. The sound echoed throughout the room. For some reason, the rain made her feel even lonelier. She lowered her head, and memories began flooding back. The watermelon harvest, the market, the village roads, the afternoons spent working under the sun, the laughter, the conversations, and most of all, CEO Quân. She remembered how he always noticed small things, how he would hand her water before she even realized she was thirsty, how he would carry the heavier baskets without complaining, how he always treated everyone with kindness. A faint smile appeared on her face. For a brief moment, the memories pushed away her fear. She could almost hear his voice, almost imagined him standing nearby. Then reality returned. She was still trapped, still waiting, still alone. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, not because she had lost hope, because she missed the people she cared about, because she wanted to go home, because she wanted all of this to end. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. Rain suddenly became heavier. The old building groaned beneath the wind. Tu Lac closed her eyes, then whispered softly, An nhat jin se tim dai min. The words were barely audible, yet somehow they gave her strength, because deep inside she believed them. Somewhere out there, CEO Quân was searching, and he would not give up. Meanwhile, outside the building, several men sat beneath a temporary shelter. One glanced toward the storm. We can't stay here much longer. Another nodded. The villagers are searching everywhere. What do we do with her? The men exchanged uneasy looks. Their confidence was disappearing. Nobody expected the entire village to become involved. Nobody expected such a massive search effort. One of them finally spoke. We move her before dawn. The others agreed. None of them noticed a faint light flickering far away between the trees. Then another, and another. Flashlights, moving slowly through the darkness, growing closer with every passing minute. Back in the forest, CEO Quân continued leading the search. Rain soaked his clothes. Mud covered his legs. Branches scratched his hands. He ignored all of it. His only focus was Tu Lac. Suddenly, one villager stopped. Wait! Everyone froze. The beam from his flashlight pointed toward a distant hillside. Far between the trees, a faint yellow light, almost hidden by the rain, but unmistakable, an abandoned building, exactly where Trin's father had described. CEO Quan's heartbeat exploded inside his chest. His eyes locked onto the distant light. For the first time all night, real hope appeared. Without saying a word, he started running. The villagers immediately followed, and somewhere ahead, hidden within the storm and darkness, Tu Lac remained unaware that help was finally drawing near. Part 2. The storm continued to rage across the forest as CEO Quan stood motionless behind a cluster of trees, his eyes locked on the abandoned storage building hidden in the darkness ahead. Rain poured relentlessly from the sky. Water dripped from his hair and ran down his face. His clothes were soaked. His shoes were covered in thick mud after hours of searching through the mountains and forest paths. But none of that mattered anymore. After a long night filled with fear, uncertainty, and desperate hope, he had finally reached the place where Tu Lac was being held. The faint yellow light shining through the cracks of the old building was enough to make his heart pound harder than ever. Behind him, dozens of villagers gathered silently beneath the storm. Some held flashlights, others carried sticks. Every face reflected the same determination. Nobody planned to leave without bringing Tu Lac home. One of the younger villagers slowly crouched beside him. "There are 4 men outside." Another villager narrowed his eyes and nodded. "I see them too." CEO Quan continued staring at the building. The shadows moving near the entrance confirmed everything. The kidnappers were still there, which meant Tu Lac was probably still inside. For the first time that night, real hope began replacing the fear that had consumed him. But there was no time to celebrate. If the kidnappers decided to move her, everything could become much more complicated. CEO Quan turned toward the villagers. His expression became firm. "We move now." Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. Everyone understood the urgency. The rain continued falling heavily. Thunder rolled through the mountains. Then CEO Quan charged forward. The villagers followed immediately. Their footsteps splashed through the mud. Branches snapped beneath their feet. The sudden movement caught the kidnappers completely off guard. One man turned around in shock. "What the?" Before he could react, 2 villagers tackled him into the ground. Another attempted to run toward the forest. Several young men immediately chased after him. A third kidnapper grabbed a wooden stick and tried to fight back, but he was quickly surrounded. The quiet clearing erupted into chaos. Shouting echoed through the storm. Flashlights swung wildly through the darkness. Inside the storage building, Tu Lac suddenly jumped to her feet. For hours she had been trapped alone inside the room, waiting, hoping, praying, trying to stay strong. Now she could hear voices outside, running footsteps, people shouting. The sounds grew louder and louder. Her heart pounded against her chest. For a brief moment, she felt afraid. Was something worse happening? Were the kidnappers moving her? Then suddenly she heard a voice she knew instantly. "Tu Lac." Everything stopped. Her eyes widened. Tears immediately filled them. She knew that voice. No matter where she was, she would always recognize it. "CEO Quan." The voice came again, closer, louder, filled with urgency. "Tu Lac." A sob escaped her lips. She rushed toward the door. The next second, a loud crash shook the room. The old wooden door trembled violently. Then another impact, and another. The lock finally gave way. The door burst open. A flashlight beam flooded the room. Standing in the doorway was CEO Quan, soaked from head to toe, covered in mud, breathing heavily, but alive, and looking directly at her. For several seconds, neither moved, neither spoke. The fear, the loneliness, the uncertainty. Everything vanished. Only the 2 of them remained. Tu Lac felt tears streaming down her face. "CEO Quan," her voice cracked. Then she ran toward him. Without hesitation, without thinking, CEO Quân immediately opened his arms. The moment she reached him, he wrapped both arms around her tightly, as though he never intended to let go again. Tu buried her face against his chest and began crying openly. All the fears she had been holding inside finally broke free. The dark room, the endless waiting, the uncertainty, the helplessness, everything poured out at once. CEO Quân closed his eyes. Relief flooded through his body. For hours he had imagined countless terrible possibilities. Now she was here, safe, alive, and in his arms. "It's okay." His voice was gentle. "I'm here." Tu nodded against his chest, unable to speak. Outside, the villagers quickly secured the remaining kidnappers. Several entered the building moments later. The moment they saw Tu unharmed, relief spread across their faces. One elderly woman wiped away tears. "Thank goodness." Another villager smiled. "We found her." CEO Quân slowly stepped back and examined Tu carefully. His eyes scanned her face, her arms, her shoulders, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." "Did they touch you?" "No." "You promise?" A faint smile appeared, despite everything. "I promise." Only then did some of the tension leave his face. Without another word, he removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. Although wet from the rain, it still offered some warmth. Tu looked up at him. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Yet both understood what the other was feeling. The fear, the relief, the gratitude, and something even deeper. Something both of them had been avoiding for a long time. Outside, the storm continued growing stronger. The villagers decided to leave immediately before conditions became worse. Everyone began heading back toward the village. This time, Tu was surrounded by people who cared about her, people who had spent the entire night searching, people who had refused to give up. As they moved through the forest, CEO Quân remained beside her every step of the way. He never wandered far, not even for a moment. Every few minutes he glanced toward her, making sure she was okay, making sure she was still there, making sure he wasn't imagining any of it. Tu eventually noticed. A small smile appeared on her face. "You keep looking at me." CEO Quân looked away briefly. "Just making sure." "I'm fine." He nodded. But only a few moments later, he looked again. That made her smile even wider. For the first time since being kidnapped, the fear inside her slowly began to disappear. Because he was here, and somehow that made everything feel safe again. The rain continued falling. Thunder echoed through the mountains. The lights of the village remained hidden somewhere beyond the forest. But for the first time all night, hope had returned. Neither of them realized that the most dangerous moment of the night was still waiting ahead. Part 2B. The rain continued falling heavily as the group slowly made their way through the forest. The rescue was finally over. The kidnappers had been captured. Tu was safe. For the first time that night, everyone felt a sense of relief. Several villagers chatted quietly as they walked. Others used their flashlights to guide the path ahead. The village was not far away now. Soon they would all be home. Soon this terrible nightmare would finally come to an end. Tu walked beside CEO Quân. Neither of them spoke for a while. The sound of rain filled the silence between them. Water dripped from the branches overhead. Thunder rolled across the distant mountains. Despite the storm surrounding them, there was an unexpected feeling of peace, because they were together again. Tu tightened the jacket around her shoulders. It was still warm from him. She glanced at CEO Quân. He was looking straight ahead, but his expression seemed distant, thoughtful, almost as if his mind was still trapped somewhere in the events of the night. For hours, he had searched desperately through fields, roads, and forests. For hours, fear had consumed him. Now she was finally beside him, yet his heart still refused to settle. The thought of losing her continued to haunt him. Tu finally broke the silence. "Thank you." CEO Quân looked toward her. "You don't have to thank me." "I do." Her voice was soft. If you hadn't found me, she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The thought alone terrified her. CEO Quan immediately slowed his pace. The villagers ahead gradually moved farther away. Rain continued falling around them. For a brief moment, it felt as though they were the only two people left in the world. CEO Quan looked directly into her eyes. There was something different in his expression, something honest, something vulnerable. When I realized you were missing, he paused, searching for the right words, words he had never spoken before. His voice became quieter. I was terrified. Tu Lak stared at him. CEO Quan rarely admitted fear, yet tonight every emotion was visible on his face. I searched every road. Rainwater slid down his cheeks. Every field. He swallowed hard. Every path in the forest. His eyes never left hers. Tu Lak felt her heartbeat quicken. CEO Quan continued. I kept telling myself that you would be okay. His voice trembled slightly, but every hour felt longer than the last. He lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her. And every minute I couldn't find you. He paused again. The next words came straight from his heart. When I couldn't find you, a painful smile appeared on his face. I finally realized how afraid I was of losing you. Everything around Tu Lak seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, the forest. None of it mattered anymore. Only his words remained. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, but because she understood exactly what he meant. And because she had been feeling the same way for a very long time. Neither spoke, neither looked away. The silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. For the first time, neither tried to hide what was in their hearts. A voice suddenly called from ahead. We're almost out of the forest. The moment was interrupted, but the feeling remained. Neither of them would forget it. They resumed walking, side by side, closer than ever before. Ahead, faint lights from the village could finally be seen through the rain. Safety was only minutes away. Everyone believed the nightmare was over. Nobody noticed the figure hidden among the trees behind them. One of the kidnappers had escaped during the confusion. Now he moved silently through the darkness. Rain soaked his clothes. Mud covered his face. Hatred burned in his eyes. In his hands was a thick wooden branch, heavy, solid, strong enough to seriously injure someone. The man watched the group carefully, his gaze locked onto CEO Quan. If it weren't for him, everything would have succeeded. If it weren't for him, their plan would never have failed. The anger inside him continued to grow, slowly, patiently. He followed, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The group continued moving toward the edge of the forest. The village lights grew brighter with every step. Nobody realized danger was closing in. Step by step, closer, closer, and closer. Tu Lak happened to glance behind her. At first, she saw nothing, only darkness, rain, trees. Then lightning flashed across the sky. For a brief second, the entire forest became visible, and her blood instantly turned cold. A man was charging toward them, fast, holding a large wooden branch high above his head. His target was clear. He was rushing straight toward CEO Quan. Fear exploded through her body. Her eyes widened. CEO Quan, watch out! Her scream cut through the storm. Everyone turned. CEO Quan spun around instantly. The moment he saw the attacker, he understood exactly what was happening. There wasn't time to think. There wasn't time to plan. There was only time to protect her. Without hesitation, he shoved Tu Lak away from him. Hard. Tu Lak stumbled sideways. The attacker was already upon them. The wooden branch came crashing down. Thud! The impact echoed through the forest. The sound was horrifying. The branch slammed directly into CEO Quan's head. Several villagers gasped in shock. Others shouted. Blood mixed with rainwater as it ran down the side of his face. CEO Quan staggered backward. His vision blurred instantly. The world spun around him. CEO Quân! Tieu screamed. She rushed toward him, but the ground beneath his feet had become dangerously slippery. Hours of heavy rain had turned the hillside into thick mud. CEO Quân struggled to stay upright. One step backward, then another. His body refused to cooperate. The blow had been too powerful. His legs weakened. His vision darkened. Behind him was a steep slope that disappeared into darkness. Everything happened in seconds. Tieu reached toward him desperately. "Don't!" Tears streamed down her face. "Please!" CEO Quân tried to regain his balance, tried to move forward, tried to reach her, but his foot suddenly slipped. His eyes widened. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Tieu stretched her hand toward him. Their eyes met. Then the ground vanished beneath him. "No!" Tieu screamed. CEO Quân slid backward. His body rolled over the edge of the slope. The hillside was steep. The rain made everything worse. He tumbled downward uncontrollably. Branches snapped beneath him. Rocks shattered apart. Mud and debris scattered everywhere. A flash of lightning illuminated the mountainside. For one terrifying second, everyone could see him falling. Then darkness swallowed him again. The flashlight in his hand slipped free. It bounced down the slope after him. The beam flickered wildly. Once, twice, 3 times, then disappeared completely. Everything became silent. Only the storm remained. Tieu stood frozen. Her entire body trembled. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her mind refused to accept what had just happened. Then reality hit. CEO Quân! She ran toward the edge of the slope, ignoring the rain, ignoring the mud, ignoring everyone around her. She dropped to her knees. Her hands dug into the wet ground. Tears mixed with rainwater on her face. "No!" Her voice broke. "No! This can't be happening!" The villagers rushed over. Several pointed their flashlights down the hillside. Others called his name repeatedly, but there was no response. Nothing. Only darkness. Only rain. Only the endless sound of wind moving through the forest. Tieu stared into the abyss below. Only minutes earlier, she had finally been reunited with him. Only minutes earlier, he had confessed the feelings hidden deep inside his heart. Now he was gone. His words echoed endlessly in her mind. "When I couldn't find you, I finally realized how afraid I was of losing you." The memory cut deeper than ever before, because now she understood exactly how much she feared losing him too. Thunder exploded overhead. The storm grew stronger. The darkness below remained silent. Nobody knew where CEO Quân had fallen. Nobody knew how badly he was injured. Nobody knew if he was even alive. Tieu cries echoed through the mountains. The villagers searched desperately with their flashlights, but the storm swallowed every answer. Far below, hidden somewhere within the darkness of the ravine, nothing could be seen. Nothing could be heard. And for the first time since being rescued, Tieu felt true fear again. A fear greater than anything she had experienced that night, because the person she cared about most had vanished before her eyes. After hours of desperate searching, CEO Quân and the villagers finally discovered the abandoned warehouse where Tieu was being held. Despite the raging storm, they launched a daring rescue mission and successfully saved her from the kidnappers. Overwhelmed with relief, Tieu broke down in tears as she reunited with CEO Quân. On their journey back through the rain-soaked forest, the emotional tension between them finally reached its peak. CEO Quân confessed that losing sight of her made him realize how terrified he was of losing her forever. Just when it seemed the nightmare was over, a surviving kidnapper launched a surprise attack from the shadows. CEO Quân sacrificed himself to protect Tieu and was struck violently before falling down a steep ravine. As his flashlight disappeared into the darkness below, Tieu was left screaming his name in despair. But is CEO Quân truly gone? Or is he still alive somewhere in the darkness? What secrets await at the bottom of the ravine? And how far will Tu go to find him? The answers will be revealed in the next emotional chapter.